You were separated from the universe by these topological defects. I turned into just one point, and then that point disappeared. There's no way to distinguish one thing from another, and there is no internal passage of time.
Today, Andres Gomez-Emilsson of the Qualia Research Institute discloses his new paradigm for modeling psychedelic perception, as well as what he thinks is actually occurring ontologically, not just perceptually, under psychedelics. His views are informed by research conducted over the past decade with hundreds of psychedelic trips in controlled settings ranging from LSD to psilocybin to DMT to 5-MeO. We discuss the mathematical underpinnings of perceptions behind psychedelic states, including, of course, the visual distortions and why we get that feeling of oneness, sometimes even nothingness and fractalness. We even cover those so-called beings encountered in DMT trips, such as the Mantis being. This was filmed at the MIT lab and was the last headline event put on by the Augmentation Lab Summit, hosted by MIT researcher Danya Baradari. I'm honored to have been invited. The summit featured talks on the future of biological and artificial intelligence, brain interfaces, and included speakers such as Stephen Wolfram, the interview of which is on this channel as well. Enjoy. This is Augmentation Lab Summit Weekend, put on by Augmentation Lab at MIT Media Lab. We're here live recording with an in-studio audience. Thank you all for coming and waiting. Okay, Andres?
Hello.
Why don't you give a brief introduction to who you are and why you're relevant to people who are psychonauts and psychedelics or psychedelic research?
Definitely. So I'm Andres. I currently run the Qualia Research Institute, one of the original co-founders. And we study consciousness, and I really try to, figure it out ideally from first principles, make mathematical models of it, try to really take phenomenology seriously, build tools to visualize phenomenology, and also figure out what pleasure and pain are fundamentally, and try to reduce suffering. There's kind of a constellation of things that we do, and essentially we're gonna, it seems like, have a conversation about exploring the state space of consciousness and visualizing it.
I want this to be valuable to people who have not taken psychedelics, to people who are extremely familiar with psychedelics. Mm-hmm. So something that gets thrown around is the word qualia. It's not quite clear what the difference between qualia and sensory input is. Mm-hmm. So what is it?
Yeah, I think that's a really important clarification, because you could potentially for hours talk with somebody about consciousness, and if your reference, for what qualia, refers to versus what sensory, stimulation refers to, don't match, you're kind of talking past each other at a very, very deep level. Here's one common misconception, I would argue, that kind of highlights these, contrast in how you might define these terms. I would argue that the way in which you experience the color blue, you can really separate it from the frequency of light that typically triggers it. In fact, there's an infinite number of ways in which you can actually experience that particular sensation by using different, combinations of frequencies of light, having a different spectral power distribution, and still get the same way in which it feels like, right? So just because it feels in a certain way, you actually don't know really what kind of sensory input it is. You just know it is from a certain family of sensory inputs. More so, there's this very weird thing that when you combine kind of the colors that are kind of at the extreme opposites of a rainbow, you get magenta, a color that is not within the spectrum, right? So all of these are kind of hints that suggest, well, the actual phenomenology, the way in which the colors feel can be perhaps separated from the idea that they map onto frequencies of light. And I think a really stark example is if you imagine somebody who has synesthesia, where they map on, let's say, sounds to color sensations, but maybe they're blind, right? So that they could actually investigate the way in which colors are related to each other, phenomenal colors, the colors that we experience, even though they have no kind of visual sensory stimulation. And one of kind of the the things that you get with this kind of like conceptual separation of, okay, like the qualia, the way in which the experience feels like versus the sensory input that triggers it, is that you can, like talk about, for example, mapping a certain state space of a certain type of experience, like, for example, all of the possible colors that you may have. You can do that, without necessarily using the traditional sensory modality that is associated to it.
For instance?
Such as different combinations of light, different frequencies. Instead, you could, in principle, like map the qualia space of color using sounds. If you have the right type of synesthesia, if you could like induce the right type of synesthesia, I would argue, be able to say things such as, hey, orange is in between yellow and red. Even though you're really kind of like just experiencing this in a way that is like triggered by sounds, right? But you still learn about like the geometry of that space if you have the right mapping. In other words, I would argue that like, people are like very like skeptical that, okay, if there's like aliens or there's like other entities out there, like in what way could we possibly understand each other? People propose also that, like, well, we would probably understand each other through like a shared understanding of mathematics, because that's kind of like universal. But I would argue potentially also about like qualia space, like whether they experience phenomenal color through, like visual stimulation or audio or like tactile feelings or imagination, or only when they dream. They can, in principle, do a series of experiments by like comparing the colors that they experience and reconstruct the space of possible phenomenal colors. And I think like when we talk to each other, we could actually use that as a shared reference that grounds our worlds of experience in a sense.
Is it the case then that someone's blue is the same as someone else's blue?
Currently, it is not known for sure. And there's like things that suggest it is the case, and things that suggest it isn't the case.
What possibly suggests that it is?
Yeah. So if you essentially like map out like the geometry of color using like different frequencies of light, you actually get like a somewhat irregular shape. Its geometry is not completely symmetrical. A classic example is like the brightest blue that you could experience is not as bright as the brightest yellow. And these, suggest, okay, there's kind of like a geometry, and like this is kind of like shared between people. And, some people who may like kind of like ground qualia space in terms of kind of the relative distances between its components and the geometry that comes from that, they may perhaps like argue that, well, okay, like, yeah, blue is in some sense defined within the qualia space as like where there's like this asymmetry, where like you can't go as bright as in this other region of the qualia space. However, there's, I think, like other hints that actually does suggest that, the state space of color is like actually really symmetrical, which is this phenomena called hyperblue, which is if you look at like a very, very bright yellow for a while, you're going to have kind of like an after image that is kind of like a blue after image. And so like if you have like really, really bright yellow, and then you right after that like present a really bright blue, the combination of like the yellow's after image together with the bright blue, like kind of like takes your qualia blue to the next level, and you see hyper blue, which is kind of a brighter blue than usually we're capable of experiencing. Suggesting, I think, that, the reason we can't experience like these like super bright blue is more having to do with like, well, the receptors that are associated to different cells in our eyes, they can't kind of like be negatively activated, right? You need to kind of like do some trickery so that like the relative proportions is as if like, okay, this had like a negative activation and it pushes you in that direction of the state space. But there is like actually like something that does break the symmetry a little bit of the color wheel, which is pure hues. Which is like, I mean, I don't know, this is an interesting test, and I would argue like, it tends to be like very, very polemical actually when I bring it up, which is like, maybe the audience or like, yeah, people seeing this at home, like, yeah, wondering like, okay, when you were a kid and you saw like, okay, like yellow and red paint mixing and making orange, is like, okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? Like orange is kind of in between the two colors. But then like blue and yellow paint and you get green, It's like, that makes no sense. It's like, where is this green coming from? It's kind of like a qualitatively different thing from both yellow and blue. And I think like, okay, like that is telling you, yeah, there's the relationship in the colors here is actually kind of different. And if you look at kind of like a linearized state space of the color qualia, usually what you will actually see is like there's, yeah, kind of like a whole line that is like pure blue. And there's a whole line that is like pure red.
Are you able to show this?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, one word of context, I suppose, like for discussing colors, is that the screens have like limitations, which is like what is the gamut, the colors that they can actually show. So there's actually a lot of things about the phenomenology of colors that are not super apparent in screens that you kind of like need to actually see in person. But yeah, like there is essentially this sort of way in which you can probe, the properties of this color space, by, for example, like showing people two hues that are like really close together. So let's say like one line here and one line here, and asking them which one looks like more pure, like kind of like which one looks like is not a mixture of anything else, any or two other things, and like people kind of like actually will converge to like a line of red. Whereas like, okay, like it's not being mixed with blue, where you get kind of like purple, and it's not being mixed with yellow. And like you just get kind of like, okay, yeah, like red kind of like breaks the symmetry. It's like there's kind of like something kind of like clearly there in a sense. And you get essentially the same with yellow and green and blue. So, I would argue here actually, like green in some sense like lives in a different dimension than both yellow and blue. Whereas orange lives in kind of the linear combination of red and yellow, right? So those patterns and the fact that we do kind of like if we do the tests, we'll say like, okay, yeah, like there were like 4 pure hues for me, there were like 4 pure hues for you. So just that at least like between people, we do share kind of like some of these features of this space, this state space of qualia in this context. However, it could be the case, and I don't know any strong argument against this other than parsimony. It's like, for example, maybe your blue is my yellow, and your yellow is my blue. Like, if you were to kind of like swap the pure hues, then it's like, okay, what other features can you actually find in in the geometry of the space to suggest that, hey, we are actually experiencing the same one? And I'm not sure if there are. So what I can say is something like, well, the mapping, like, I don't think it's going to be the case that, for example, you experience orange when I experience blue, but maybe you experience yellow. So like maybe you experience a pure hue. Yeah.
Okay, let's get to some psychedelic visuals.
Yeah. Okay, so actually just like jumping right into it, this is like one of the, for example, like really trippy states in one of the tools that I'm going to be displaying today. This is kind of like exceptionally trippy, right? And it's like, okay, like if your visual field is being saturated with psychedelic visuals to that extent, right? You probably shouldn't be outside, would be my suggestion. You definitely need a seater. Now, these level of intensity usually, unless you're like overdosing on like mushrooms, like usually would be something like, okay, you're doing like DMT, where, yeah, like maybe the actual sensations from the environment become kind of like this very relatively faint contributor to the experience. But this is kind of a teaser. Yes,
you're not going to be just showing visuals and then saying, "Look how cool this looks."
No,
you're going to be saying, "Okay, here's what is correlated with certain psychedelics, like LSD is different than DMT, which is different than 5-MeO," and then you're going to say, "Why does it look like this, and how is it produced?"
Yeah.
So why don't we start off simple? Yeah. Show what ordinary perception looks like.
I think like one fruitful way of starting is like kind of like showcasing some of the simple effects that this tool can give you. I mean, this is kind of like well-known things such as like drifting effects. This is very fast, but for example, like your experience being a little bit wobbly is one of the maybe kind of like primary things that psychedelics do, like kind of like making the field of experience a little bit wobbly. Explaining actually like how that happens, I think it's very non-trivial. But okay, like that's a very, very basic thing that you can kind of like do. And of course, like it gets interesting when you combine it with other effects. But just as kind of like, okay, that's like the A of the ABC of making these replications. The second one is kind of like adding like deep dream layers. So this is a little bit subtle, but like you may see actually kind of like in some regions it gets a little bit kind of like enhanced, and it looks a little bit trippy. You see there's kind of like these like waves where like, okay, maybe the edges get highlighted. And so one of the, simple interesting ideas is like, okay, you choose different layers of the, deep dream algorithm. So maybe on low doses, you highlight kind of just like edges or something like that.
Low doses of,
let's say, like psilocybin or LSD, mescaline. Maybe in higher doses, maybe like, higher level features start to become highlighted, like, okay, like eyes and, dog ears and things like that. And like, okay, like birds, like, okay, the rocks start to look like a bunch of birds put together. I guess like, the highest layer for some reason is, very abstract, at least in this particular rendition.
What are you doing with these different layers? Are you saying that when you're on a psychedelic, for people who have not experienced psychedelics, that you then start to see this? What determines which of those layers it is? And how did you come up with those layers? Are there more layers?
Yeah. Okay, so this is essentially like bringing back like a relatively old idea for how to like replicate psychedelic visuals. The deep dream algorithm, I've got to, fact check this, but I remember like in 2015, it came, I think, like from Google, like people were like playing with like, large neural networks, and they found that, okay, like if you kind of like clamp a high level feature in one of these networks and like make the input, fit the type of input that would like maximally activate this feature, then you can kind of like get these very trippy images, because it's like the image is, being kind of like asked to, hey, maximize the output, or like the probability that the network will say like that you're a dog, right? So like at first it's kind of like starts to make everything a little bit having like dog ears, or a little bit of like dog eyes, and just kind of trying to trick the network into believing that there's a dog in there. And people just like, wrote blogs online about, hey, this looks really trippy. And like, like in the psychonaut community, there were definitely like a lot of posts, and there was kind of like a fad for like a few years where people were like replicating their psychedelic experiences primarily using this tool. But there's a lot of, open questions here. Like of course, like there's like the physiological and biological question, like, okay, like why would psychedelics have kind of this like, ability to clamp these high level features? Other questions is like, yes, exactly, like which layer, should we use?
Can you show an example of this dog clamping that you're referring to?
Yes, I guess it has some of it.
I don't think this is related to...
There you go.
Okay, never mind.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, I guess like here's probably like going through the layers. So yeah, I guess you kind of like try to amplify as much as possible features for a given layer, and then
you consciously try to amplify it, or
no, like I guess like you as the designer of the network, you set one of these neurons to kind of like, okay, like maximum activity, and try to arrange the rest of the network to do that.
This is an example of what one sees.
I would say this is kind of like a paradigm that people have identified as phenomenologically similar to psychedelic experiences. I mean, there are like significant differences between, the visuals that you experience and these, and in fact, like that is actually kind of like the motivation for like our replication tool. Is everybody in our team essentially like really loves, like playing with deep dream, but like essentially see like very deep limitations in it. And it's sometimes actually a little bit frustrating, because you may see kind of like a movies, where they play kind of, okay, like a psychedelic experience rendition. And people get the impression is like, okay, yeah, culturally, we already know how this works, how people understand how this actually looks like. There's like this illusion of understanding, at the very least, like culturally. Whereas, yeah, people who usually, have explored the space quite deeply will say, No, really, the cultural depictions of psychedelics maybe capture like 1% of what's interesting about the state, but there's kind of like 99 that is like, okay, like how do we actually put this into into a visualization or something that actually evokes us or is yeah, very difficult. So yeah, deep dream, I would say, is like, okay, yeah, this is like a certain percentage of the puzzle.
Okay. And so we'll get back to the tool that you've developed.
Yes. Okay. So,
and what's interesting is that this is a tool. Most of these visualizations that you see, they're not ones with sliders. They're just something you can press play on. Whereas yours, you have these modulators here and there. And sure, there are discrete drop-down boxes,
yes,
such as the layer 1, 2, and so on.
Yeah.
But that's rare in this. So this means that you can tell exactly what is going on in different experiences. I don't usually stop mid-conversation to talk about sleep, but I've been using something that's made an appreciable difference. It's called Evening Being by Verso. Now, if you're like me, getting quality sleep while juggling work and stress and everything else isn't exactly straightforward. I've tried various routines. By the way, I have my sleep hygiene on point, like avoiding screens, for instance, after a certain time, and don't eat after a certain time. But sometimes the stress accumulates. It does this for all of us, and deep sleep gets harder. Evening Being uses research-backed ingredients that help your body calm an active mind. This formula is melatonin-free, by the way, which means there's no dependencies or morning grogginess. I know some people get that. This formula also helps improve deep and REM sleep cycles and supports staying asleep longer. Basically, it tells your body to relax and to wake less. Since taking it, I and my wife have noticed that we've fallen asleep faster, so sleep latency is lower. I also feel more refreshed. My energy is distinctly more stable throughout the day, and I'm discernibly quicker mentally. I haven't changed anything else about my supplement regimen. I've just added this to my nighttime routine, and it's helped me sleep consistently without forcing it. Something else to note is that Verso third-party tests every batch and publishes the results. This matters to me personally because I want to know exactly what I'm getting. If you're looking to dial in your sleep quality and recovery and wake up actually rested, then check it out. Head to evening.ver.so/TOE and use the code TOE to get 15% off your first order. That's evening.ver.so/TOE. Again, the code is TOE. Thanks to Verso for sponsoring this episode.
The way in which I'm trying to kind of pitch it, in a sense, is like a Photoshop for the phenomenology of psychedelic experiences, right? It's like, it's like how do you make a Photoshop of something? In a sense, it's like, well, you think of like the range of kind of like primitive effects that you need to reconstruct a phenomenon, right? If you're going to simulate something, if you're going to, engineering software, for example, okay, like what kind of materials do I need? What is there's, how much stress can they endure and things like that. So like, okay, like what do you put in a Photoshop for, psychedelic experiences? And of course, it's going to be a long journey, many decades of like building more and more features, as we actually find and formalize what's happening. But I do think like, this year we're presenting a kind of like layer of the stack that we think actually like does contribute significantly to our ability to visualize these states. Perhaps kind of like a similar kind of like improvement in our ability to visualize things, as I would say like maybe Deep Dream was back then.
Okay, let's see what else.
Okay, so there is this whole layer of coupled oscillators. And okay, right now actually it's just like going up and down.
But can you explain what an oscillator is, please?
Yes, it's
then a coupled one.
Okay, so here is an oscillator. In this case, it's kind of like there's a dot that is changing in color. And, what happens is like it's changing its color at a certain rate. And it kind of like wants to do it at, its own rate. It's kind of, it has a heartbeat, as it were. It has its desirable frequency, like where it's as healthy as possible. But then it needs to coexist, in an ecosystem of other, oscillators like it that maybe are going at slightly different frequencies. But, they're in touch. They communicate with each other. So, the way in which, mathematically it works is that kind of like the two oscillators are like sensing each other. and they can like measure each other's phase, where along the color wheel they are. And as a function of how far away they are from each other, they make bigger or smaller adjustments so that, slowly they actually kind of like converge their phase. If they actually have like enough of a desire to couple. Now, there's also, in this case, there's another element, which is distance. So kind of like the desire for an oscillator to couple with another in kind of like the paradigm that we're presenting is distance dependent. Okay, so right now, for example, I'm going to make it so that they actually want to be in opposite phases of each other. So the current simulation is set up where like all of the oscillators will want to be at a different phase than their neighbors, or like the things that are like close to them. So what ends up happening here is you have kind of like this like diversity of colors, right? Because like people, well, the oscillators don't want to be similar to those who are close by. But then I can switch this up so that like they actually do want to be in the same phase with each other. Right. And the nice thing is that this is kind of this like very smooth, soft, kind of like continuous transition, from like, oh, we want to be different to, hey, we want to be the same. And in some sense, I think like, at least I find, aesthetically, the process of convergence in general tends to be quite beautiful, especially for like very sophisticated systems. So one thing that you can do here, I'll just like give you a couple more examples. And this is kind of like the toy model that then informs how the tool works more broadly. So here, it's kind of like I'm making a street of oscillators. So there's actually some kind of like, similarity as you go from left to right. It doesn't have to be perfect. That's another thing. Like with this paradigm, there's kind of like wiggle room. It's kind of like organic in that sense. You're not kind of just finding like one solution and like imposing it, but like the system kind of like adapts itself. So what I'm going to do now is I want like oscillators that are far away for them to want to be different from each other. So now, as you see, close by, they're the same color, but far away, they're different colors. Now,
just a moment. So at the top here, you see coupling 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So the near ones you've put to a positive number.
Yes.
And the bottom one you put to an extreme negative number as far as it can go.
Yes, exactly. And I'll show you like another set of configurations here. Right? It's like, of course, if I put when they're far, they want to be in the same color, but now when they're close, they want to be at different colors. Okay, then it fragments, right? Actually, it fragments quite extremely, right? Like even kind of like vertically. At first, kind of like it, it breaks down vertically too, right? Like if this is supposed to be, I don't know, like a vein or like something that is kind of like transporting, let's say like water or like some fluid. Perhaps if it breaks like this, it's pretty catastrophic, right? Because it's kind of like cutting across the vein, so to speak. Okay, so here's like a overall like really cool thing about systems like this is that, if you kind of like do these layers of like, you identify different distances and you modulate the coupling constant for each of the different distances, you can use that to actually kind of like tune into waves of different lengths. So depending on the specific kind of like staircase of couplings, I can make the wave larger or smaller. And I think, like this is, kind of like the basic setup. Maybe I'll show another kind of, like fascinating thing, which is that you can actually use this kind of system as a diagnosis in a sense for like, kind of like what type of shape, a set of oscillators are forming. Because for example, if I put it in a circle and I make them kind of like want to be different from each other, it will break in kind of this like symmetrical way, right? Like where like the entire circle becomes kind of a color wheel, right? And it will always try to kind of like break up into kind of like an integer number of times. So you get kind of this like, not always, I mean like sometimes it kind of like toggles between one mode and another, but like the stable configurations that it arrives at, tend to essentially be those where like you have kind of like an integer number of times that the phase fits in the system. And this is like very, very, very general in that like also, when you make grids, and even grids of different dimensionalities. Yeah, actually, I'm going to show you. So what I'm going to show you actually now is like kind of like a three-dimensional system of coupled oscillators. So this is an article on cessations. Okay, yeah, perfect. I found it. Okay, so you see like now it's a three-dimensional.
Can you zoom in?
Lattice, yeah. So you see like when there's like a wave traveling in it.
Yes.
Right, it kind of like finds one of the symmetries of the object. In this case, okay, like the wave is kind of like traveling along this square essentially, and like it, if I put it kind of like orthogonal, like this, it's the same.
What's determining the size?
The size of the wave is determined by the pattern of what we're calling the coupling kernel. We're calling it the coupling kernel. I mean, simply because it's this idea that like, a convolutional kernel is like where you stand at a pixel, for example, and you look at a kind of like a fixed window around you, and maybe you convolve with it. Here is kind of the analogy, the analog of doing that, but for kind of like a dynamic system, which is like you stand everywhere and you apply kind of like the same coupling constants to your neighborhood as everybody else. And then you see the emergent dynamics of doing that. And in this case, the wavelength is fairly low, is kind of the entire shape.
Okay, so we get the idea that, look, you have these different balls you can put on screen, you can put them in different shapes, and they can look to their neighbor and say, I want to be more like you, or I want to be less like you.
Yes.
And they can also do so with different distances. So I could say, I want to be more like you, much less than you, but much more like you in the back. And that's what you're tuning there. So what? Like, it's cool. It's interesting. Now, what is the relevance here to psychedelics?
Yeah. Okay. So a couple more things to explain this is, one thing that you can do is kind of like play with the dimensionality of the space on which you're kind of applying these rules. So I'm going to do something a little bit trippy, which is, this is really cool because right now, like the wave is actually in 3 dimensions. I don't know if it's obvious, but like I kind of need to rotate it a little bit for you to kind of like really see that like, yes, this is a cube, and there's kind of this resonant mode in the cube. Okay, but what was before is a stranger, which is like, it doesn't matter how I project it. Like I could project it like this, like a hexagon, for example, and I still get just kind of like this wave is like, going in circles, and then I project it from this side, and it's still going in a circle, and I project it from this side, and it's still going in a circle, right? Like, what is going on in here? So this is, I think, something that happens all the time in our consciousness, and it explains a lot of psychedelic effects. Which is like, what's happening here is like now the distances between the dots are the distances in the screen, kind of like in the projection. So like rather than the dots kind of like thinking like, oh, I'm in a cube, it's like, no, I'm in a screen. And like, right now there's a bunch of dots that are like overlapping with each other. And so of course they're going to be like the same color, even though in principle there should be like another dimension there. And when you have kind of these effects, you can do things such as, kind of like make tubes, for example, and now light, the color will kind of like travel through these paths as well. So I think, one of these kind of like things that is happening in our experience that explains a lot of like psychedelic effects is that there are kind of like 3-dimensional waves of sensation in our tactile field that like, like senses, the sense of warmth or cold or expansion and contraction in our body. It's kind of like this like 3D volume, and it has kind of like 3D waves, that look maybe more like this. Is kind of like you actually have this volume. Our visual field, on the other hand, has kind of this like very strong preference for kind of like this 2-dimensional layout, where waves are really kind of like 2-dimensional generally. And of course, there's like some depth perception that kind of like stitches together different types of waves. But in general, there's kind of like this like tendency for 2-dimensionality. So I think like a lot of the like interesting kind of like computationally non-trivial things that happen on psychedelics is that you project with synesthesia, your sense of your body, for example, into your visual field. And, you're connecting something that has like three-dimensional resonant modes with a surface that is two-dimensional and has like two-dimensional resonant modes as its preference. And so the actual phenomenology is this negotiation between three-dimensional resonant waves and two-dimensional ones, and how they're trying to couple with each other. Which causes like all kinds of like fascinating dialogues where, like maybe your arm over here is projected in a certain way. They're like, okay, the waves actually do, harmonize with it. The waves in the visual field and the waves in the tactile field need to kind of like solve a Rubik's Cube in a sense to be able to harmonize properly.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
It's somewhat related. So in ordinary studies of consciousness or just perception, you think of the world, we have this model where you think of the world as the ground truth, and then you're never experiencing the world, you're experiencing some filtration of it, and that gets augmented and messed around with. Okay. But ordinarily what you do is you play around with the world, and then you say, okay, I want the patient to experience so-and-so. But you are just looking inside the brain at your Qualia Research Institute is already looking at phenomenon inside. Is there anything, can you go in the opposite direction? Have you discovered anything about ontology or what you think of as the real world from perceptions inside the brain? Because of how they're supposed to be correlated with the real world.
Yeah. Excellent question. I mean, I'm making the bet essentially that, the structure of consciousness, the phenomenology of consciousness, the way in which sensations can bind together, is telling us something really deep about the nature of reality. That it is essentially, okay, like you are a particular facet of reality. And so if you can study, kind of the laws of phenomenology, I think like you are in a sense like tapping into the laws of the universe at a very deep level. And there are like, things that are, I would say at least like really hint at very deep connections, I think like with physics. I'm not a physicist. I'm a physics fan, really. But I don't want to speak about like the mathematics of the Standard Model or something like that. But I do suspect that kind of like things evocative of, for example, the ideas we discussed in our previous podcast, which was kind of how in physics you have kind of things such as like particles and antiparticles that cancel out, turning to like photons and things like that. There's a lot of kind of like aspects of phenomenology where things in qualia space have kind of like a structure where it feels like oftentimes kind of like from the vacuum, so to speak, the vacuum splits into kind of like two things that are like opposite and complementary to each other. And like something like DMT tends to, in some sense, kind of like split the vacuum into the kind of like polar opposites of things. So it's like, okay, the sense of space in front of you, the colors, a given point may kind of like split into blue and yellow. It's kind of like a color and its anti-color, and everything is kind of like doing that. Everything is kind of like invoking its opposite and kind of like oscillating with it. Whereas 5-MeO DMT, it feels actually like the movement is one of kind of like, hey, every particle find your antiparticle. Like everything cancel out with your kind of opposite until you smooth out completely. So, like a peak 5-MeO DMT experience often is described as kind of like merging with the white light of the universe or becoming one with emptiness, and like there's a lot of kind of like evocative things like that. That to me it strongly suggests a deep connection with symmetry and kind of like the cancellation of opposites. Another like very interesting hint here is there's like some doses of 5-MeO DMT where, for example, all of your visual field and your tactile field kind of like diffracts into what looks like a rainbow, or like the whole color wheel. And then if you increase the dose a little bit and you kind of like look at it from the side, it all kind of like cancels out into pure space. So there is kind of this phenomenology where you can kind of like study the ways in which, in some sense, things are equivalent to nothing at a very, very, very deep level. And I mean, I suspect, if teams of very smart people continue to really, really try to figure this out, I think like there's a lot of like promising information.
What do you mean it appears like it's equivalent to nothing?
Yeah.
You mean to say like how from out of the vacuum you can get something positive and negative?
Yeah. This is in allusion to David Pearce's Zero Ontology. I recommend a lot this website. It's like a 90s website. In general, like headweb.com by David Pearce, a philosopher from whom I draw a lot of inspiration. And he has this essay of like, why does anything exist? And he kind of like lays out this case that like in mathematics and physics and phenomenology, we have this kind of like overarching pattern where you can kind of reconstruct everything out of nothingness in some sense. I mean, like he says, like we probably don't yet have like the proper words to really talk about this. We're in a kind of like pre-paradigmatic stage, really, where like, what we say is like kind of like pointing to an explanation space rather than a full theory. But he argues, okay, in mathematics, you can get everything from the empty set, so to speak. In physics, things like, well, what is the total angular momentum of the universe? People argue like it's zero, or I don't know. There's a lot of debate in there. But then in phenomenology, it's like, colors seem to kind of like come in pairs. The sense of space seems to require a sense of time. Like there's kind of like these interrelated variables in experience and consciousness, where like at very, very kind of like peak symmetry states of consciousness, where things are kind of like symmetrifying, harmonizing, synchronizing, you kind of see a kind of like a cancellation process, and which is very evocative of like, well, maybe at the base there's kind of like really nothing. It's I don't know. Also, people like the phenomenology of high dose 5-MeO DMT is very often, people will say things such as like, wow, like the truth is that everything is happening simultaneously, or something like that. Like it's everything everywhere all at once type of feeling.
Are you able to show that type of feeling?
Yeah. Let's do that.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna essentially show you kind of like what 5-MeO DMT might feel like a little bit, and some qualitative aspects of it. So I guess again, for a little bit of context, like the coupled oscillators that I was showing you in the replication tool, practically it's kind of like every pixel is one of these oscillators, and it's using the GPU. I developed the core idea, but like this is the work of a whole team, and I'm especially thankful to Emil Hall, who built so much of this, and he really optimized it. So like the GPU is actually simulating all of the oscillators. So here, in this setting, essentially I'm using a black and white kind of like system of coupled oscillators. And I'm going to make it so, well, I'm going to increase the opacity. So it's like, okay, you're a pretty strong dose. And as you're coming up, this thing happens where like, at first, okay, actually I'm going to replicate it. Yeah, something like this. At first, you're coming up and it's kind of like this. And as you're going up, the lines start to kind of like cancel with each other. And you see there's like kind of like pinwheels, those pinwheels, and you can think of them as kind of these like particles in experience, and they find kind of like each other and they annihilate. Well, then also, like kind of like secondary effects happens sometimes, that you get kind of these like additional extra waves. But in general, there's kind of like this general tendency that as you increase kind of like the coupling constant and you keep it positive, the whole screen converges to kind of like just black and white, and these like very big pinwheels find each other and they cancel each other out. And that, what I'll show you now, it's from our website, from the various legal psychedelic retreats that we have run. One of the things that we kind of like all converged on, this was like a very widely reported phenomenon in the team. We were 12 people with kind of like technical backgrounds, like studying 5-MeO DMT phenomenology. After an experience, we might like sit down and discuss, and somebody who knows how to write shaders would write these within half an hour.
Wow.
And then it's like, hey, we were all comment is like, yeah, actually that feels like our experience. And in general, everybody who tried 5-MeO, at least in our retreat, of course, is biased because they're like people who are into math, are into meditation, are into visual art, but they all reported that this process of kind of the generation of these pinwheels, what they're called like topological defects, and then their cancellation was kind of like really quintessential to the phenomenology of 5-MeO DMT. I really like this animation too. This is kind of like the the vacuum, so to speak. Maybe like universal consciousness before it's divided, so to speak, and then it turns into kind of these like particle and antiparticle sort of, or like this vortex and anti-vortex. And on 5-MeO DMT, it feels like the way in which your experience is constructed is kind of like a bunch of stilts that are made of these kind of like defects. And when they cancel out, you kind of feel like you're rejoining kind of the sea of the universe, which is like, okay, you were kind of like separated from the universe by these topological defects. Is the overall impression. I mean, again, I'm not gonna I'm describing phenomenology here rather than necessarily metaphysics. Yeah.
But do you have any metaphysical views?
I'm totally open to various interpretations here. I mean, I think you were interested in kind of like group effects or collective effects. You briefly asked me yesterday, or synchronizing trips and things like that. I'm very open. I used to be actually, I used to put the bulk of my probability mass into kind of like everything that happens in a psychedelic is an internal hallucination. Very rich, you can learn a lot about the unconscious. You can learn about, about consciousness, and it's very computationally significant and so on. But it's just a part of your world simulation. Like that would be kind of like the bulk of my probability mass a few years ago. And now I'm actually a little bit more open to like, no, actually there's other phenomena as well that might involve kind of like coupled oscillators, but within a larger field, in a sense that includes not only your own experience but others around you, and maybe other things as well. But very huge error bars in here. Very, very, very high amount of uncertainty. But yes, I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah.
Have you done any tests where if someone's in this room, say, not this particular room, but in a room, and they're on, let's say they're on 5-MeO. I'm not sure if that's the most optimal use of 5-MeO or for this. And then someone else is in some other room where they can't see you, and then I'm showing you a string of letters, and I say, okay, you look at these string of letters, then I ask you, can you reach this person's mind? Because if you're a part of a unified field, you should have some access. Have you done something like that?
Okay, so I mean, let me provide a bit more context, because like we held one 5-MeO DMT retreat which was in Canada in 2023. It was for me like a huge highlight of my life, really, just kind of like being with all of these other like nerdy kids and like visual artists and mathematicians, meditators, and like spending 3 weeks trying to figure out how this works. Utterly mind blowing. But there's only so much you can fit in that time. We focused a lot on the visual phenomenology, on kind of like, hey, like what kind of equations may be underneath these, or the topology, the geometry, etc. We did, do a couple kind of like wacky experiments. I mean, like one of the things that was like widely reported, especially from the meditators, this has to be replicated, and like, I don't know how much this is self-suggestion, but something that was like, quite strongly reported independently by several of the people in the retreat was that when somebody takes 5-MeO DMT in the same room as you, there is a vibe shift. And in particular, for the meditators, they said that time to samadhi shortened significantly, meaning that they're like really advanced meditators where they can enter into like the various jhanas, these very, very advanced concentration states within minutes. And for one of them, for example, it might usually take them like 10 minutes to enter into one of those like trances or altered states. And he said that when somebody was on 5-MeO DMT within a few meters of him, like it would kind of like half the amount of time.
So he's not on it, but the other person is?
Yes. And still kind of there's like this sense of like, well, the gradient of going in the meditation direction is like kind of like lubricated, as it were. It's a bit entrancing to be around somebody on 5-MeO. Then again, we were running kind of like blind tests of like, okay, maybe this person is actually on, it's just like vapor, is a placebo or something like that. Right. We weren't doing that.
Or test by putting someone else with 5-MeO behind the wall, but they don't know.
No, I mean, it would be fascinating. Again, it's, of course, like there's something to be said about like, 5-MeO is like, very, 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 very profound, and is like hard to, actually kind of like follow like complex instructions if you're in the state. But if somebody's
what about others like LSD?
Actually, it is interesting. I mean, like I've for example, like at festivals like Burning Man, I've something I've sometimes done, especially with people, kind of like I know or friends of friends, is like going with an iPad, and with like a psychophysics experiment. It's like, hey, like look at this picture, like what does it look like? And in general, people who are experienced with psychedelics can usually answer like fairly basic kind of like visual, tasks. Usually, actually, they think their performance is a lot worse than what it is. It's kind of the opposite than with drunk people who are like, "Oh, my performance is totally great," and actually they're like, 10th percentile or something. No, on LSD, I'm very surprised. It's like somebody might do like kind of like a task very often and think like, "Hey, like, did I do it like really poorly?" And it's like, "No, you were average." Like,
yeah,
but yeah, and of course, for the psychedelic cryptography, like, which I don't know if we've talked about that, or we ran this contest or competition where people would submit videos where the idea is like, well, there's like some kind of secret information here that you can only read or decode if you're like on a certain psychedelic state of consciousness. I originally
interesting.
Originally, I came up with this idea, like the very basic implementation, which is like how to secretly communicate with people on LSD. And you see, like the very simple concept here is that you use the fact that there's kind of this like tracer effect in the visual field. Things kind of like last longer in the visual field, so that you can kind of like paint, the components of an image one chunk at a time. And kind of because it lingers, you can kind of like see it more easily. There's also like features that you can see more easily, like for example, like the gaps between the various columns here. Right, it's not obvious in the left that there's gaps, right? So even that is kind of like binary communication, right? It's like, are there gaps between these rows or not? But yeah, you can actually, it turns out, do like some pretty awesome visualizations. So this was the winning entry. This one actually contains like a significant amount of information. Like you do need to be significantly high though, like like the equivalent of like 150 micrograms of LSD or something. Is kind of like the threshold where like it starts to become like quite visible. I mean, and again, we still need to really validate these, get like percentages, get optimize the effect. What I can say is that in a team of 8 people trying to decode these without knowing what's in it, 6 were able to do so like easily on mushrooms.
What do you decode here? What do you see?
Yeah, actually, I mean, like the mechanism is very simple with this particular psychedelic cryptography, which is that you kind of like put a tracer effect on this image. And actually, I don't want to spoil it. I'm not going to say what's in it.
Okay.
So that, you don't know. And maybe you can convince yourself that it works if you look at it. But, don't look at it at a microdose and then judge that it doesn't work, because a microdose is not going to do it. Like you really need to be.
So there's a hidden message here.
Yeah, and it's like unambiguous. I mean, it's like there's a very clear message with a lot of bits of information. It's not unambiguous. Like, oh, I'm not sure. Yeah,
it's a safe message.
Yeah. It's pro-social. Yes, it's a good message.
Okay, just because you also want to be careful.
Yeah, it's a family-friendly message. Yeah, so 5-MeO DMT. One of like our overarching conclusions is that like these defects would appear like in the visual field, in the tactile field, and how good or bad the experience felt had a lot to do actually with kind of like the flow of kind of like energy and the particular shape of the field. I mean, sometimes like, for example, this can be kind of like a fairly unpleasant 5-MeO DMT experience. Like if you have kind of this like sense that like, okay, the energy is like concentrating in this like point in the bottom of your spine, that actually was described as like very unpleasant, because you get kind of this feeling of kind of like pressurization. You feel kind of like pressurized in some regions, or like stretched.
Does it feel painful?
It feels just very uncomfortable. And it is obviously very hard to describe, but it's sort of kind of, like a lot of kind of layers of yourself are kind of like sheared in this kind of like uncomfortable way that is very unusual, and you would never experience it, during exercise or something. Just a very unusual effect. But, in this particular experience, this report, he described that like the valence was extremely bad at first, which was, like concentrating this kind of like sense of pressure. But then the field lines actually kind of like aligned, and they all became parallel. And then the valence flipped from extremely negative to extremely positive.
Super interesting. So
Yeah.
I was speaking with someone recently about he was just meditating, completely sober, and then he felt extreme pain in his lower back, extreme pain.
Yeah.
And then extreme pleasure. And then he said it just kept oscillating between that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was from meditating, and he had to stop meditating from that. So this can happen. Like, what is the explanation for that?
Yeah, no, I mean, meditation, it's really powerful, and like there's so many different states that you can access. And I mean, I think like the description that you gave would be consistent with it. Off the top of my head, like maybe like 5 different types of meditation and different phenomenology, but
it was a variation of transcendental meditation.
Okay,
I don't know if that helps.
It might actually be like somewhat related to this sort of phenomena, because with transcendental meditation, in some of the typical modalities, like you're repeating a mantra, for example, and you're concentrating your attention in a part of your body. Sometimes, let's say, like in your crown chakra, kind of like just ahead, a little bit over, the top of your head. You can imagine, okay, like you're concentrating like there, like, an hour a day. You're kind of like smoothing what we might call your attention field lines. It's like, okay, whenever you get distracted, you tell your body like, no, don't think about this. Move your attention back upwards, right? So you're creating kind of this graph of like wherever you're paying attention, it's pushing in that direction. And so you're ordering kind of like your attention field, as it were. And I think like, when the field is really ordered, actually, usually you can access the extremes of valence. Because when it's very ordered and actually harmonious and symmetrical, that is like a complete kind of like state of harmony, and it feels really great. But also when it's a little bit disjointed, right? It's like you're very ordered, but maybe it's a little bit out of phase, or a little bit kind of like screwed up at the very tip. You may also encounter the strongest dissonances, right? Because it's like you're very aligned, but then maybe pushing against yourself. And so there's this very broad phenomenon, I mean, and meditation, and especially 5-MeO-DMT demonstrates it, is that around very peak positive valence, oftentimes you have kind of like other configurations that are especially unpleasant. And I think like a lot of, kind of like developing like, deep meditative expertise involves kind of like developing the equanimity to be able to navigate those transitions. It's like knowing that, well, actually, right next to the bliss or like the awakening or realization, there's actually some fairly ugly, unpleasant dissonances and discordant configurations.
Is this what Reiki is supposed to be aligning?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know very much about Reiki. But in general, though, I would argue that the framework of kind of like annealing, or like a field annealing, neural annealing, broadly kind of like explains the practices of energy work very, very generally. I mean, like you're using things such as like various tools like surprise and attention to imagine like energy flow in your body, and essentially, kind of like heating yourself up so that you can like cool down. And you can imagine, okay, like with annealing materials, right? Like if you can heat up a material and then letting it cool, you can reorder its atomic lattice. Well, in so many ways, we are kind of like made of kind of like crystals of sensations, right? So it's like if you heat up parts of yourself and like kind of like use your attention to kind of like recomb yourself, I think like fundamentally you're using kind of like annealing techniques. And I think this applies to a lot of martial arts as well. Like it's a very broad framework. Mm-hmm.
I went to a Reiki, I don't know what they're called, master or artist or what have you, once a week for a period of months. And every time I saw her, she would always say that I'm disordered. Whatever's the worst insults that you could say in Reiki terms would apply to me, and she would just go like this to my back, not touching my back. She just, but I wouldn't feel any different before or after.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So have you encountered if Reiki, is there legitimacy to Reiki? Is there consonance with Reiki and any of what you've outlined here today?
Let me say the following. I mean, I think like, okay, like if you assume that there's actually some legitimacy to some of these techniques, it might make sense that like you need to kind of like have like at least some kind of like basic kind of like flexibility in your energy body, so to speak, and like desire to experience the effect for it to also work. Like I see that as like compatible. So like if one goes like very skeptical, it might make sense. Like one doesn't experience it.
Okay.
But
she
no,
would tell me after that, oh, everything is aligned. You're good now. Like you're so much better. And I'm like, I feel exactly the same. But thank you so much.
Yes. I mean, yeah. I personally would imagine it's unlikely that something. I mean, it sounds like a scam, but what I can say is like I do know
it was a free service. This is why. So I didn't pay for this service. Otherwise, I don't think I would have done it. But maybe that shows that I'm skeptical.
So we did see.
I'm somewhat frustrated because she's like taking up so much of my time. But
no. I mean, yesterday, like we saw the hypnotist, right? I don't know if you saw the hypnotist.
Yeah, no, the hypnotist is fantastic. The hypnotist Albert Nuremberg, which I'll place a link on screen and in the description, was fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, talking afterwards with him, like he, of course, you should interview him at some, because like he was describing like, orgasms being triggered by like hypnosis and like reaching extreme levels, or like what he called as like super orgasm. Anyway, there's gonna be like all in a TV series or something pretty soon. You know, one interesting, I think like maybe like skeptical take would be something like maybe Reiki practitioners are really good hypnotists, right? Like, like if you can induce these really powerful experiences relatively easy with kind of these attention tricks, like presumably there's like a lot of ways of like hacking a person, so to speak. But also, you know, speaking personally, I know people who swear by some like interesting effects that they have experienced like non-locally from somebody else, like doing energy work on them, and like it's
interesting.
Very hard to say. What I can say, like, you know, from personal experience, again, I remain open-minded, but just I haven't seen like a silver bullet of things like this. But during the 5-MeO retreat, in addition to the time to samadhi kind of like shortening, also people reported feeling each other's traumas and kind of like processing it for each other. Like, for example, one of the, you know, meditation practitioners who is kind of like really equanimous, you know, he's been in monasteries for years, and he's a super great guy, and like he can endure a lot of pain without problem, for example. So like sometimes like one of the things that would be reported is like, okay, this person is having a difficult 5-MeO experience processing, let's say like childhood trauma or something like that. And then he reported that just having the advanced meditator right next to him was extremely powerful because the trauma kind of like was processed or dissipated through him. And also the meditator reported that's what happened afterwards as well. So there were kind of, like reported phenomenology that suggested a kind of like shared field, especially when people were like both simultaneously on a state. We did try like one psi experiment, which was unsuccessful. Like I was with with one of the participants, really friendly, one of the artists, and it was like, okay, like give me a number from 0 to 100 while like I'm in the state, and he's also in the state, and like I think like you know, he actually was like 37, and I reported 87, and
but 37 is the most common.
Yeah. So 5-MeO DMT. Qualitatively, one of the things that we all did kind of like converge on is that it seems like it instantiates kind of this self-organizing principle where everything in your experience wants to cohere with everything else. And you know, the emergence of kind of the pinwheels, I think is downstream of that. It's like whenever you have kind of these like systems of coupled oscillators, especially when it has like rich dimensionality or like multiple layers, and you make them all want to be one with each other, so to speak. The pinwheels is just like something that you encounter along the way. Whereas, you know, we also contrasted it with like, you know, ayahuasca and some mushrooms, for example. Let me find like some good kind of replication of that. And essentially, there's kind of like some key differences, which is like, like not only is it like much more colorful, but also you have like this effect where you have like very rich detail. And like essentially kind of like fractally at every scale, every sensation kind of like triggers its opposite. So in some sense, you get kind of these like the attractor states is like where you have like all of these opposites kind of like reconciled in some kind of like tapestry where everything is kind of like invoking its opposite, but still the experience manages to include it into some kind of like overall perspective that, it's usually really diverse and rich in contrast. And in that sense, it's almost kind of like opposite of 5-MeO DMT. I mean, we used to describe it as kind of a 5-MeO DMT promotes global coherence in your overall system, whereas regular DMT, what's in ayahuasca, causes these competing clusters of coherence. Kind of like, yes.
So which one is the one when people say, I've experienced everything and everything is happening all at once, everywhere?
That would be 5-MeO DMT, which would be the colorless and like the black and white, where you get kind of like the pinwheels like this. These would be more like the 5-MeO DMT, where like, and especially as the pinwheels eventually collapse into each other, people might say something like, well, it felt like a black hole where I collapsed, or like I turned into just one point, for example. It's a often reported thing. And I turned into just one point, and then that point disappeared is also like another thing people say. And when you just become one point, you're not really a person. I mean, like you don't remember who you are or where you are. Ideally you feel pretty safe though. It's like that's you're having a good experience, and at least in our retreat, almost everybody had like overall pretty good experiences. But the information content is very minimal. It's like there's not much happening in there other than like a very intense experience of nothingness. Whereas, ayahuasca, psilocybin is much more like this, in that like everything is richly structured. And usually there's actually like several layers of oscillators talking to each other. Let me just like find a pattern here. That kind of like,
now we're speaking plenty about the visuals,
but
also there's temporal perceptions, distortions often. So that you'll feel like you have lived this life and other lives 10 times over.
Sure.
And the eternity passed. It's difficult to say with our ordinary words. How can eternity pass? Explain how that works.
The article I would point to kind of like explain like the phenomenology of like temporal distortions on various psychedelics is this one. I mean, I titled it the Pseudo-Time arrow. I mean, let me explain like the title. So it's kind of like I want to distinguish between the phenomenology of the passage of time and actual physical time, right? Like, and physicists, I mean, there's a huge debate on like what is time, as people who watch your channel will probably know. And but things such as like, okay, like there's like an arrow along which entropy is increasing. Some people might define time in that way, and I think it's very worthwhile to kind of like think of physical time, as like something that may not be identical to the feeling of the passage of time. Because like, if you take 5-MeO DMT and you say like, oh, everything stopped, it's not like literally, the whole universe stopped and like, from outside everybody also stopped, right? Like it's more kind of the phenomenology of time was like deeply altered. So the question is like, can we reconstruct why time feels the way in which it feels, like appealing just to the structure of the experience, as opposed to kind of like appealing to like a physical time that you're accessing? And what I'm exploring here is effectively how kind of like the stacking of sensations allow the generation of an internal arrow of time. So the idea is that, okay, like there's kind of this like physical time, but also, as we were saying, that there's like these tracer effects, things last longer on psychedelics, right? I think like normally there's always also a tracer effect regardless. And I think that's like essential for the generation of the feeling of time is just very thin. And in some sense, the things that are a little bit further into the past, they're like fainter. So there's kind of this like arrow of realism. It's kind of what's like more recent is like more vivid. And you can kind of reconstruct how things are changing and in what direction things are moving by kind of like the arrow of how things are becoming fainter over time. And now on psychedelics, let's say like this is what I might call like a sober pseudo-time arrow is kind of how the sensations become fainter, how they refer to each other. Maybe on psychedelics, because everything lasts longer, the internal arrow of time is longer in a sense. You have like more sensations that are accumulated over time and that are referencing each other.
Yes.
So there's like a sense of like you're in an expanded time in a sense, just as a generic effect of these substances. But then on the special cases, or kind of like the interesting corner cases, is where, for example, like the the sense of the arrow of time may wrap around and actually connect with itself. This happens involuntarily often if you are listening to like really repetitive music on psychedelics. Like if you're at a trance festival and like you took 3 hits of acid, you may feel like, oh my gosh, like I'm in a time loop and I've been here for who knows how long, because the music kind of like wraps around the it may close. It may make your future the same as your past.
Yes.
And I think like legitimately something really interesting is actually happening to the topology of your attention. Like it is a very exotic configuration of consciousness. But I don't think you're breaking space-time, in a more literal sense. But internally, it's a very unusual phenomenology. Oh, the thing that actually I think does happen on something like 5-MeO DMT is more a kind of like central collapse. It's a little bit more kind of like time stops. When everything synchronizes, with all of the sensations synchronized and they're kind of like in phase, there's no way to distinguish one thing from another. And like, there is no internal passage of time. I mean, I would maybe describe it this way, which is like, if you have like a lot of, kind of like clocks moving near to each other, but there's no absolute frame of reference, where like all they can know about like how time passes is by looking at the differences in their phases internally, right? But if suddenly all the clocks are moving together, right?
I see.
Internally, it's like there's no time, right? And so like when you have kind of this like hypersynchrony across many different aspects of you, it's kind of like time may stop for the parts that are synchronized with each other. And like a peak 5-MeO DMT experience is like your body and mind figures out how to synchronize everything, kind of like reprojecting it from the right way so that everything is in phase. And subjectively, that feels like, there's just no time, or it's timeless, outside of space and time, so to speak.
Now, what about the experiences of entering other animals' lives and other people's lives and past lives and so on?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I could really comment on that. I haven't really kind of like seen firsthand people really reference like past lives.
Have you experienced that yourself?
No. I mean, like the most unusual kind of like thing I have personally experienced, which is widely reported, and I definitely should like write about it, is more about sensing when a family member like dies, like that is like pretty often reported, and sometimes you may have kind of like a complex hallucination or like some kind of mystical experience. If anything, that is the one thing I would say, like, okay, there's probably personally it feels like there's like a signal there. But no, like hallucinations of past lives or something like that. Yeah, I wouldn't say like I've experienced that. Yeah.
If we go back to how we started, which is these coupled oscillators, if you don't mind going back.
Yeah. This is like the kind of like toy model example.
Okay. In none of this can I see how you could ever come up with a Mantis alien DMT encounter. So where do those come from?
Yeah. One thing I will say to begin with is that, okay, whether these are kind of there's like some influence from kind of external intelligences or not, it is very clear that like what you hallucinate on, let's say like DMT or various psychedelics, it patterns on top of your own world model. And so there is this overall framework we call psychedelic thermodynamics, which is this idea that, on a psychedelic, kind of like the energy of your consciousness increases, like everything is like brighter, things are like more wobbly, there's more flexibility. In some senses, you're like heated up in a way. And there's like energy sinks that locally kind of like crystallize your experience. And essentially, semantic content, like things that you can recognize, we think function as kind of these energy sinks, is actually kind of like a shrink wrapping, when you're on DMT and like the world is very wobbly, if something kind of looks like a jaguar, the field may start to kind of like shrink wrap around as if it kind of like plays the role of the jaguar. And this shrink wrapping effect, actually, I would describe it as a cooling effect. It's like when the flexible world sheet of experience approaches something that you've seen before, it cools around it. And effectively, your experience kind of like crystallizes on things that you have experienced before. It kind of like finds energy sinks to crystallize around. And like there's two things it tends to crystallize around. One is like semantic content. For example, the concept of a car, for example, like it can be like things at that level of abstraction. And then the other thing is like symmetries, like repeating patterns, kind of like crystallographic, structures. And those are kind of like much more universal and like, cultural neutral in a sense. So, I would imagine, for example, like the actual kind of symmetrical visuals that people in the Amazon who take ayahuasca experience is probably the same symmetrical visuals as, you and I would. But the semantic content that they experience is probably quite different, because it's culture bound.
Why don't you show some of these entities that can be encountered?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to rely on my friend Symmetric Vision, who is like this awesome artist, and he's been to some of the QRI retreats. And I would say, kind of like a world-class at replicating psychedelic visuals. And I believe this one is kind of like a DMT replication. It's a little bit long, so let me just kind of fast forward. It's kind of like at first, there's like relatively... Oh, okay. Oh, God. Okay, yeah, there's also like eyes closed versus eyes open. But okay, you see like there's a lot of kind of like these efforts of the field to kind of symmetrify and like harmonize the various patterns. If you close your eyes, you're kind of like in a different world. But if you go sufficiently high in the dose, it doesn't matter whether you have the eyes open or closed. And yeah, these very intricate structures happen where tubes, for example, are like fairly common. Tubes along which waves travel. And the tubes, often have like a lot of depth effects. Kind of they play with depth. They can compress and like look like they go very, 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 very far away from you, and then they expand, and it's kind of like they're very close to you. So extreme kind of like depth illusion kind of phenomenology is extremely common. And I will say that, okay, like the actual model that we have for how this happens requires more than just coupled oscillators. And it requires actually like kind of like something analogous to video feedback, which is the idea that like, one of the things that our overall kind of a system is doing and is capable of is taking a chunk of your experience, edit it in some way, and then put it back into your visual field or your tactile field. I mean, the most classic example is if you enter, like a bathroom where there's like a mirror, your world simulation immediately kind of like knows how to kind of like copy everything on the left to make it go on the right. And internally, you're not confused, right? Like you're not kind of like if we pass the mirror test, you understand that it's not like there's a room behind the mirror, right? Like your world simulation is capable of handling those relationships. And, like on something like DMT, kind of like that capacity gets really exploited, where like, every surface can briefly, for example, be interpreted as like, well, this is the surface of a mirror that is reflecting something else in the scene. And the capacity for kind of like tracking those correspondences goes through the roof, where you may see like, okay, this mirror is reflecting this other mirror, which is reflecting this other mirror, which is reflecting the original mirror.
We'll get back to the mirror, but right now, what's going on here?
This is a seraphim. No, is it a seraphim? Well, it's one of these kind of like a biblical type angels. Multiple arms or tubes, kind of like a insectoid head, some vibrating like, time vortex in the center.
This is a commonly encountered entity.
Well, the theme of kind of these like super intelligent insectoid mind hive thing with lots of arms that are made of like lots of like parts that reflect each other, and they're all kind of interconnected. That is like, like very, very, very classic high dose DMT. Like people will absolutely recognize these. Yeah.
Okay, getting back to the mirrors.
Yes, getting back to the mirrors.
So you're saying that you interpret every surface, everything as a mirror reflecting everything else.
Yes.
You can also relate that to Indra's net.
Yes. Yes. I'm going to show you something. Where the video feedback has this ability to like shear, reflect, like do all these transformations. Like navigating the DMT space is kind of doing this. It's like you're applying some like rotation or transformation, shear effect on a piece of the kaleidoscope that is connected to everything else. So like the response in the field to a small change can be really dramatic. It can be like, okay, I think like I'm just like reaching, my arm over here, but it's actually like doing this weird contortion, and you flip from one side of the fractal to the other.
Wow.
Yeah. But even this is like selling it short, because this is just with one channel, where like you have like just one camera that is essentially just being reflected and refracted. In a full kind of like the DMT circuit, so to speak, or like the circuit of the visual field that is maybe revealed by DMT in a sense, you have like multiple channels. I mean, essentially you have kind of like various cameras, and some of those cameras are actually looking at the screen. And so there's like, yes, several levels of complexity higher, in fact. But on top of that, though, there's also the coupled oscillators dynamics that are happening in addition to these mirroring effects. Yeah.
So, what is your job? How do you make a living? Is this your full-time work?
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, psychedelic visualization is a component of what I do. I am a full-time, consciousness researcher at QRI. We're funded by essentially, people who are like believers in our research,
donors.
Yeah, donors. We do want to make what we do ultimately self-sustaining, and like I'm happy to talk about like various paths that I think are like plausible to make that happen. But yeah, I mean, effectively, people who I knew and who knew me, and that we were already very interested in figuring out consciousness, who then became like lucky with cryptocurrency, for example. That's like one of the kind of categories of donors. We also get like a few grants here and there as well. But yeah, like the bulk of our research and like the retreats have been funded by like very generous people.
In part, I ask because plenty of the people who are watching this may have some cash that they would like to donate. And so what's the website?
Yeah, qri.org. And we accept donations, and like I think like they go really far. Like I can just like make a very quick pitch.
Please,
if you're interested in the psychedelic kind of visualization efforts, right? Like we're going to be open sourcing this tool. We're going to be crowdsourcing data points so that we get, like thousands of people kind of like rate and rank and qualify this phenomenology, see how accurate it is. Which I think is, yes, kind of like a service to the world in a sense, like being able to like give people parameters to replicate their experience, give them a Photoshop of their consciousness, so to speak. And if you think of kind of like the finance of these efforts, I mean, like if you look at, like one of the, let's say like in classic academia, how you run a study, right? Like there was like a famous study that studied like candy flipping, which is LSD plus MDMA. And what they did is like they used like standard measures, like questionnaires, where they gave either LSD or LSD plus MDMA to participants, and then they asked them to fill out a questionnaire, like the mystical experiences questionnaire. And they find, hey, actually the questionnaire doesn't show a difference between the two. And they conclude, well, MDMA probably doesn't add anything to the psychedelic experience. But it's like, well, that just means your instruments are like poorly calibrated, right? Like there's clearly a difference. Psychonauts like will generally agree there's a huge difference, and so on. And one study like that costs like millions of dollars, right? Like actually getting like all of these infrastructure and like doing it in a lab. At QRI, we were able to do things such as like organizing like week-long retreats in a place like Brazil for really cheap, and actually being able to go through hundreds of like visual experiments over the course of several weeks with people who are like really passionate, who not only will, they're not going to fill out a questionnaire, really, they're going to be like writing a report about their phenomenology and what they learned. And there's a lot of like collective knowledge that gets generated this way that then we make publicly available. So I would argue in terms of kind of like the information theory of like, hey, how do you explore consciousness? I would argue our approach is a huge kind of like force multiplier, right? Like we're able to do a lot of experiments for very cheap and find the ones that are like really interesting. Yeah.
Andres, thank you.
Thank you so much, Curt. This is fascinating.
Okay. Don't go anywhere. There's actually a Q&A from the live audience at this MIT Media Lab Augmentation Summit event, which is on the Substack, Jaimungal.com. That is CurtJaimungal. You don't want to miss it. If you're a fan of this episode, you'll enjoy the Q&A. Hi there, Curt here. If you'd like more content from Theories of Everything and the very best listening experience, then be sure to check out my Substack at Jaimungal.org. Some of the top perks are that every week you get brand new episodes ahead of time. You also get bonus written content exclusively for our members. That's CurtJaimungal.org. You can also just search my name and the word Substack on Google. Since I started that Substack, it somehow already became number 2 in the science category. Now, Substack, for those who are unfamiliar, is like a newsletter, one that's beautifully formatted, there's zero spam. This is the best place to follow the content of this channel that isn't anywhere else. It's not on YouTube, it's not on Patreon. It's exclusive to the Substack, it's free. There are ways for you to support me on Substack if you want, and you'll get special bonuses if you do. Several people ask me, like, hey, Curt, you've spoken to so many people in the fields of theoretical physics, of philosophy, of consciousness. What are your thoughts, man? Well, while I remain impartial in interviews, this Substack is a way to peer into my present deliberations on these topics. And it's the perfect way to support me directly. CurtJaimungal.org or search Curt Jaimungal Substack on Google. Oh, and I've received several messages, emails, and comments from professors and researchers saying that they recommend Theories of Everything to their students. That's fantastic. If you're a professor or a lecturer or what have you, and there's a particular standout episode that students can benefit from, or your friends, please do share. And of course, a huge thank you to our advertising sponsor, The Economist. Visit economist.com/toe, TOE, to get a massive discount on their annual subscription. I subscribe to The Economist, and you'll love it as well. Toe is actually the only podcast that they currently partner with, so it's a huge honor for me, and for you, you're getting an exclusive discount. That's economist.com/toe, TOE. And finally, you should know this podcast is on iTunes, it's on Spotify, it's on all the audio platforms. All you have to do is type in Theories of Everything and you'll find it. I know my last name is complicated, so maybe you don't want to type in Jaimungal, but you can type in Theories of Everything and you'll find it. Personally, I gain from rewatching lectures and podcasts. I also read in the comment that Toe listeners also gain from replaying. So how about instead you re-listen on one of those platforms like iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, whatever podcast catcher you use, I'm there with you. Thank you for listening.